So I think the major challenge in researching children's online activities globally is that the media ecology that children inhabit is changing fast. So the platforms and the services they are using are rapidly changing. So we should learn to focus on practices rather than specific services and platforms, bearing in mind that mobile devices are now there and they are increasingly taken for granted by children themselves. But where mobility doesn't always mean using in mobile context, but it means especially privatization and greater connectivity.
I think the biggest challenge is that we think of this as researching digital technology. Technology is not good, it's not bad, it's just part of the environment, right? Roads are technology. They have risks for children, they have advantages for children. Newspapers, television, radio, they're all part of the technological reality that children inhabit. And I think we need to focus more on the human behavior around children, specifically the caregivers and mediators of children's experience, rather than focusing on the technology, which is always changing.
Well, I think definitely in South Africa it's contextualizing the research. I think it's being able to make sure the research is representative of all the populations, that's questions are phrased and that the research is framed in a way that children relate to, that's sort of contemporary. And I think making sure that we get the balance between sort of high quality evidence research that government can use and governments are interested in, but also research that's accessible to the general public as well, because I think there's a lot of interest in finding out what's going on from parents, from teachers, from the broader population.
In my opinion, I think that we have two key challenges when researching children's rights in the digital age. The first one is something that we've constantly been facing with whatever type of research that we do on children, which is to account for children's voices in our reporting, in our research, and so on. To what extent we can actually carry and capitalize on our research, and depend on our research to actually carry children's voices. The second one, which I think is very important in the digital age, is the fact that we need to consider that children are communicating across national borders, and they're communicating in various languages, with various tools, with various platforms. So it's no longer, it's a whole wide world in that sense. And to be able to actually understand it in a way that is not locked in the national or the platform type of approach.
So I think we face three challenges. The first challenge is about, China is a big country, and urban, rural difference in China. The urban children, they are very different from rural children. So that is the first challenge. The second challenge, in China we have about 100 million migrant children. So migrant children and left behind children. So it is very difficult if we conduct some survey, even qualitative research may be very difficult, because you can't find them. They are floating. So the last one is about, I think, most Chinese people, they don't believe children. So they think maybe children are very vulnerable and very weak. So most adults, they like to control them. So I think maybe it's very difficult to make positive aspect of children using ICTs visible in our society. And I think many people, they don't like to see the positive aspect on children using ICTs. So
I think one of the key challenges in trying to research children's online and digital activities is that we often focus on the notion of the child only in its relationship with the digital, right? But when we go into the field, we are very aware of the fact that children have multiple roles, multiple contexts, multiple practices, and different visions of how they imagine their own futures. So when you start thinking about the child only as a consumer or a producer or somebody who has access or is penetrated by technologies, what we often do is we reduce the scope of our research, and in the process it becomes this complete silo which doesn't always make sense in terms of how to deal with children. So instead of falling into this online and offline binary, it perhaps becomes exciting, and this is a positive binary, right? Saying there's children going online. It might be interesting to begin by looking at what is a child, what are its roles within a society, what are the different contexts within which it can be placed and understood, and most importantly, what is the child's own vision of the future that it has to inherit that we are trying to build for itself. So if we can bring together these questions of, on the one hand, not determining the notion of a child only as that which has access to the digital, and on the other, as the child having a stake in what it wants to do for its own future, that might be the biggest challenge that we have right now.
Well, the challenge in research in digital activities is similar to lots of challenges that we have in doing research with children in general. First of all, about reaching all the groups of children, the marginalized children, children who are in institutions, children who live on the streets. Second challenge is also about all the practicalities of research. How do you carry research out in rural, urban areas, remote areas? But also when it comes to research in general and global research or cross-country research, how do we make a balance between the standardized quantitative research and also qualitative that explains more contextual differences? When it comes to children and ICT in particular, I think we have a challenge of staying accurate because it's such a fast evolving field, and being able to really ask the right questions to talk to children about what matters in their lives, their experiences, and using ICT, but also understanding from them and hearing from them what is it that matters to them before we even start doing our research. So these are the challenges that we have, but they're not unsurmountable. I think the cooperation among many researchers, partners that we have here today and these next 2 days will really help us come to some of the solutions to these issues.
Well, the main challenge, I think, for us in a country as vast as Brazil is understanding the regional and socioeconomic inequalities and how to address this issue in such a different and diverse country.
I think it's important that we make sure we listen to children, that we get the opportunity to hear their voices. I think if we don't do that, we run the risk of taking a very sort of adult-centric approach, meaning that we tend to the risks and fears that exist in the adult population, and we don't really get the right information about what children feel strongly about.
For me, a key challenge is to improve our knowledge of opportunities and not focusing only on risks, which is sometimes the main subject for public policy or some stakeholders. From my academic point of view, the thing is that we have to focus on opportunities, even some of them that are not very common. For example, how even young people are being involved in social movements, for example. In Chile, that's the case. So that's something very important for us, the link between digital opportunities and civil society organization for very young people even.
I think that some challenges in terms of the research here, I mean, research amongst children is always challenging anyway. There are lots of practical difficulties in terms of levels of comprehension, how you access the children, you know, getting permission to interview children is required. But of course, as soon as you involve that level of gatekeeping from a parent or other responsible adult, you introduce the possibility that you will be refused access. And of course, many of the children whose views we would be most interested to hear are the very ones where we would be refused access. That's a big level of complexity. Then there's the whole issue of interviewing children of different ages. You know, what are their various levels of comprehension? Can you ask them the same questions? If you ask them different questions or ask the same questions in different ways, are those strictly comparable? And you need to then think about the fact that, you know, that's just one market. You multiply that by all of the different markets you're doing the research in. You know, how comparable is what you're doing at the end of the day? There are other aspects, of course, which are around to what extent are children in every country. So the experience of a 14-year-old in the developed world is going to be very different indeed from the experience of, say, a 9-year-old in the Far West, or, you know, in India. So how do you frame questions that apply equally to both? So there are lots of challenges in this area. It's a fascinating topic to discuss.
The key challenge, quick background, I'm from a UN agency, the ITU, and we work with policymakers all the time. Those are our constituencies, and the key challenge is building awareness among policymakers on the importance of this topic.
So one of the key challenges that we at the GSMA have found is actually getting the research started off. So our mobile operators tend to sponsor the research, and getting to the point in time where we can find the funding and get the agreement and get the research kicked off is one of the key challenges, because the different objectives that different operators have and the need for the research vary so much across the world.
Well, as I can see it now, the key challenge for research, I would say, is to be the most relevant possible, to answer actual questions on the users of this market research, and I think there are many kind of users. So being relevant is definitely one thing, and to be relevant, I think the research need to be maybe have a time frame which is actually faster than what we have today. The time between conducting a research and having the analysis and presenting the analysis, I think, is a bit too long. So we need to get faster and promote the research results so that it has more impact.
There are major methodological challenges connected with researching children's use of the internet and the digital space generally. But if I had to pick a number one issue, it'd have to be funding. Too much of the research is precariously financed, or we have to go to industry or different places that you might not want to go to. So a better funding base would be my number one priority.
Thank you. In researching children's digital activity, I see one of the challenges ethical issues, which I think are not necessarily globally very well defined, and then unless the country has proper legislation and capacity in the country, it might not respect all the global ethical principles. And some of the issues that are not solved, such as parental consent or anonymity, are very, very important when researching very sensitive issues, which are also part of digital life of children. The other issue which I would like to raise is really understanding children and involving children from the beginning of the research in designing and defining questions. I think we are not as strong with capacities in working really with children and researching really with children, which I think is necessary because they're actually the drivers and they're actually the natives of this world, and they're ones who can really give a very good advice, and that will influence the quality of the research.
Well, I think that the main challenge in Egypt is that we need to look at the child, to have a perspective, a child-centric perspective, rather than look at the different agendas of different entities. And this is quite difficult because different entities have vested interest and they want to look at that perspective which serves their objectives. But it's very important also to look to the child as an independent actor, and this is one of the main challenges that we're facing. However, I think that there are several entities in Egypt that have a very keen interest to develop a good research agenda for children. Different ministries are willing to cooperate together. This is a long process, it's a hectic process, but it is feasible. Recently, in particular, we have realized more and more the problems that children have in Egypt, offline and online. And there is an increasing awareness of what is happening online. And I think that the government is becoming more cognizant of what is going on and also more willing to engage into research in this respect.
So from my perspective, it's a question about how we triangulate between different methodologies. So we've heard a lot today about also the quantitative contributions of survey research, but survey research doesn't necessarily get us into the perspective of the children themselves. So I'm very keen to also see how we can triangulate that with qualitative research and also participatory research, particularly with the children, so that the children don't just become objects that we observe or that we kind of ask or prod, but children who are actually subjects of their own personal development and well-being.
The biggest challenge for researching children's digital activities is in getting the global plan right for producing comparable research data. But equally challenging is implementing the research right on the ground. And I'm so happy that actually that the symposium today has the best brains across the world to bring in the experience from different dimensions needed for the success of this initiative on the ground.
I think one of the key challenges is to capture the diversity of children's lives and in different cultural contexts. Understanding how boys use the internet, understanding how girls use the internet, understanding how rural children use mobile phones, understanding how urban children are using mobile phones. So it's really about capturing what are the realities of different children.
The main challenge, I think, is to move away from adult-centric approaches and adult-centric moral panics around some of this work and actually get beneath the surface and understand what children's lives are like now in the digital world and actually what many of these technologies actually mean to children and young people.
I see the key challenge in the region that I work in, which is Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as trying to integrate it in the work that we are already doing. I work for UNICEF and our main result area of work is on inclusive education, on preventing violence against children, and these already link in quite naturally. For example, on inclusive education is also making sure that children have access to the digital world and in a safe, protected way.
I think there are several kinds of challenges in researching children's digital activities, and one is the question of what are the important digital activities for children themselves, which should we be asking about the things that are really opportunities for them or exciting for them, and which are the things that are problematic for them as they see it. Then there's a host of kind of methodological challenges about how they refer to different digital activities, what kinds of terms they use, what kinds of questions we might want to ask as researchers that they would understand. And then there are kind of policy questions. I mean, one wants to understand children's digital activities in relation to the current policy agenda and what kinds of interventions educators or legislators or child welfare experts might be ready to make so that you have the data that is of value to them.
Some of the key challenges in researching children's digital activities are the speed of change, I think, in the use of digital activities among children and in particular. And so if you're trying to look at change over time or chart the experience of children as they grow up, then this will be influenced by the fact that the technology itself is changing over time. And in my experience of surveying 11-year-olds and then preparing a questionnaire for 14-year-olds, we wanted to repeat some of the questions, and there was the issue about whether the questions were any more appropriate, whether the examples we gave were appropriate. So in one version we had an example for, do you use things like Bibo, and that had already gone. And I think our own lesser technological awareness, that not being very embedded in children's lives ourselves as adults, we don't necessarily know what their changing experience is, which means that it's really important to test thoroughly and to do a lot of exploration. So with the Millennium Cohort Study, we did do some specific exploration of what children were using, how they were using the technologies, to try and make things appropriate for their age, but this meant they weren't necessarily appropriate for comparison over time.
I think there's quite a few challenges. I think it's the fact that there is no consistency in terms of the approach currently because of the very fast-moving environment around the kind of digital world, and I think there's interest that I think the EU Kids Online has kind of put together a foundation of what the research could look like, but realistically, financially, it's not going to be a kind of a model that can be adapted, and therefore the kind of the landscape is very wild across the world. So there are very different approaches to address this, and kind of putting it all under a same umbrella and providing comparable information. I think that's the big challenge.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things that I think we should look at, there are many things, is getting the children's perspective, getting the children to state what they understand by things, getting them to reflect on what other people suggest in their own terms, but also to some extent to get them to sort out their own priorities, because, you know, in this whole area there's a lot of stakeholders who have issues that they think children should address or want them to address or so on, but you have to put it in the child's own world, and you know there might be some things, I think there are, that they prioritise over the risk agenda issues that we cover here. And to get at those type of things, well, I would say this, wouldn't I, because my area of speciality is qualitative research. I think you have to get them to talk in their own language, which you won't get necessarily in surveys unless you ask certain open-ended questions, and you can only do that to a limited extent.
Well, I think the key challenge is to understand how they do these activities, because I have been in contact with Brazil. I belong to the Kids Online in Portugal, and I've compared the results between Portugal and Brazil, and they are not, apparently they are not so different, but the conditions how Brazilian and European children access to the online are quite different, and of course this affects how they assess, what they do, what conditions they have to explore more the internet. And I think the big challenge for this global project that we are designing here is to have real evidence how children go online, using which devices, how frequently they can go, what is the connection they have. So these kind of things, it's really important to have this information, because children everywhere, they like to be in contact with peers, so they like to use the potentialities of the social networking sites and messaging and things like that, but sometimes they don't have the same conditions to do other kind of things, and even to do these basic things they didn't do in the same way.
I think we face several challenges, and this in the seminar, several have been addressed already in terms of involving children and the methodological challenges. So what I'd like to talk about is the communication and economic challenges. I think, especially for academics, oftentimes our research does not get communicated to the larger public, and a lot of times we don't understand really how to translate research speak into something that would be useful. So I think we have a challenge there in better communicating and disseminating our research. And the second challenge is funding. Several foundations, governments say that this work is very essential and necessary, and yet the money doesn't seem to follow. So I think we need to be more strategic about fundraising and working with multi-stakeholder groups, including industry and governments, to try to find a way to fund this very important work.
The key challenge is the fast changing environment in these matters. So yeah, to kind of catch up on the ever developing use of digital technologies by children.